Well, welcome to tonight's study. Those of us here, as well as those that are joining us on the video this week. And before we get any further, I'm sorry, Joe, I'm going to have to cut you out of your job again this week. But let us stop and take time to go to the Lord. Most wonderful and gracious Heavenly Father, we are thankful again for this opportunity to come to know more about you as we study your mighty and your holy word. God, there is so much wisdom within these pages that if we studied them for 10 lifetimes, we wouldn't be able to get all that you have for us out of it. So, Lord, we are thankful just for tonight, just for this time and this little bit of information that we will be able to glean. And we just ask for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, that you would be with us, that you would help guide our hearts, our thoughts, and God, just give us that spirit to soak up everything we hear here tonight. It is in the mighty name of Jesus we ask all these things. Amen. So we picked up we started the story of Solomon last week. You know, David went down to the grave. There was a little bit of a skirmish between which one of his sons was going to take over for him, because it wasn't like the world would think would be the case, where the oldest son, or at least in this case the oldest surviving son, would take over. But one of his younger sons, Solomon, ended up with the throne. David gave him some instructions, but probably the most important instruction that he gave his son Solomon is, look, if you do things the way you're supposed to, God is going to bless you. If you don't, it's not going to go so well. Well, Solomon starts off gangbusters. We saw that. I mean, he's a child. He tells God he's a child in chapter 6, saying, you know, hey, God, I'm just a child. I don't know how to lead. I don't know if he meant that more mentally, because I don't really know how old he was. But anyway, he understands he's not up to the task, and he asks God, instead of for power or money or prestige, he says, give me wisdom to lead your people. So he's off to gangbuster start. When we pick up tonight with chapter 11, we'll see that, man, that train that is just going right down the rails so beautifully is all of a sudden off the track. I mean, he's off in left field. So we start off in chapter 11 with an account of Solomon's wives. He ends up taking many wives, but not just any wives. Remember last week we talked about him marrying Pharaoh's daughter. She was a beautiful woman. He ends up marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, well, she's a foreign woman, but God doesn't seem to frown on that. Well, he ended up taking wives from all these other tribes, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. Do those names sound familiar from our time together, gathered around this table? These are names of tribes that the Israelites were supposed to wipe off the face of the earth. And we already talked about this, my friends, about why that was supposed to happen. In fact, I believe we talked about it with Miss Paula that night, because she was she was horrified by the fact that God says, kill anything that moves. Man, woman, child, it doesn't matter if it breathes, kill it. And we talked about the reason behind that is because God knew that they would be a snare to the people, to the Israelites, who were supposed to be set apart, to live differently. And here we have Solomon marrying women from these tribes. And God warned him not to intermarry. And he says, here's what's going to happen. If you marry these women, they will pull your heart away from me. You will end up worshiping their gods, and you will turn away from me as your God. But old Solomon loved them anyway. Here's how much he loved them. He ended up having 700 wives of royal birth. 700 wives.
That's a lot of anniversaries.
Ooh, that's enough. You know, and if that's not enough, if that seems like a lot, he took 300 concubines on top of that. And then was it around? It was around this table. Somebody asked a question about what was the difference between a concubine and a wife, right? Yeah, Dickie, that's right. Still haven't made that distinction in my mind, other than maybe just a legalistic thing. But however you want to look at it, this man's now got plus or minus 1,000 women at his disposal. I can't imagine, other than some egotistical power trip, why this king would have to have so many wives and concubines, but he does. And as God predicted, his wives lead him astray. He gets older. You figure we get wiser with age, but he started getting evidently more foolish as he aged. And his wives turned him to other gods. he was not as fully devoted to God as his father David was. He ended up, because his wives worshiped these foreign gods, he ended up setting up these shrines to these foreign gods, and he ended up following Ashereth and Molech. I say Ashereth. The name that's in my Bible is, he followed Ashereth, who was the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And in doing so, the Bible tells us there in verse 6 that Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Ooh, that is a powerful term. We're going to hear from here all the way through the end of Chronicles. We're going to hear this time and time again. And they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he did not follow the Lord completely as his father had done. He goes to a hill east of Jerusalem and he builds a high place. In other words, a shrine or a temple to Chemosh, who was the detestable god of Moab, as well as Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. This is something that God would find just about unforgivable. And he did this for all of his foreign wives. So he set up shrines to these foreign gods for all of his foreign wives. And he not only did that, he burned incense and offered sacrifice for them. And so the Lord gets angry with him, with Solomon, as we would imagine he would. And he talks to Solomon. He says, Solomon, since you have not kept my decree, since you didn't follow that great advice that that your father David gave you, I'm going to punish you. He said, there's going to be a price to pay. I've given you the entire kingdom. Your father David united it under one kingdom. I gave it to you. I will take it away from you. He says, but because I was so tight with your father David, since him and I were we were on the same page here, out of respect for your father David, I'll wait until you are dead. I'm not going to do it while you're alive, but I will tear the kingdom away from your ancestors after you are dead. Then, since the punishment of taking the kingdom away won't happen until after he's dead, God does punish him in the form of adversaries. So God raised up a couple of adversaries against him. First, there was this Edomite named Hadad. When Joab was killing all the male Edomites back under David, Hadad ended up running away down to Egypt. And he did quite well for himself. This is like a hyperlink story here where we read about Hadad going to Egypt and the Pharaoh providing for him, even giving him a wife, one of his wife's sisters. He gives to Hadad for his wife, gives him everything he needs. This should be like a hyperlink. Egypt evidently used to be a pretty accommodating place. They were very hospitable. Remember when Joseph ends up down there as a slave and ends up rising to the top? And then Joseph brings his dad and all his brothers down there during the time of the famine, and Pharaoh's just like, man, Joseph's my main guy here. So, if you're with him, you're good with me. Take anything you want, the best of all that Egypt has to offer. Well, we see a similar situation here with Hadad. When he hears that David has died, he decides to pack up and go back up around Israel. The Pharaoh says, why do you want to do that? Haven't I given you everything you need right here? You got it pretty good here. He's like, yeah, it's been nice, but there's no place like home. Just let me go on back home. And so he returns to Israel and becomes a thorn in Solomon's side. Likewise, a guy named Rezon was another adversary. He was, so Hadad comes from the south. Rezon was up in the north. He ends up in present-day Iran is where he's from.
Well, Hadad was a relative or a son of Solomon?
But he was an Edomite. So he would have been...
Yeah, and the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon. Hadad the Edomite, he was of the king's seed in Edom.
Right, in Edom. Solomon is not an Edomite. Solomon is an Israelite. Yeah. Edomite, they were one of those tribes.
So he was from the king of Edom.
Right, yeah.
Not King Solomon.
Not King Solomon, right. So he's from the royal line of Edom. But remember, David was waging war against the neighbors around him, and his commander Joab was out there killing all the male Edomites, and this guy escaped and kind of took off south for Egypt. But Rezon was from the north, and he was another adversary that was raised up against him. And then there's a guy named Jeroboam. Now Jeroboam was not an outside adversary. He was not an Edomite. He was not, let's see, Rezon, like I said, he come out of north, but Jeroboam rises up from inside. He is one of Solomon's officials. And one day he's out walking, and he's wearing this nice robe out for a walk in the country, and he meets a prophet. And the prophet says, "Hey, Jeroboam, that's a nice cloak you got there. Can I see it for a second?" And he takes Jeroboam's cloak and he starts ripping it up into pieces. And he rips it up into 12 pieces. And he hands 12 of those, or 10 of those 12 pieces back to Jeroboam. And he says, "This is what the Lord says." And this is one of the many ways God uses object lessons. He says, just like I tore this cloak up, God is going to tear the kingdom away from the line of Solomon. He says, God wants you to know you're going to get 10 of the 12 tribes of Egypt, or of Israel. You will be the king over 10 tribes. For David's sake, God is going to keep a tribe and give them. So a line of David will always have at least one tribe, but you're going to get 10 of them. And so with that promise, Jeroboam is chosen by God to succeed Solomon as king. Now remember, sometimes man's choice and God's choice are two different things. So we'll see that in just a minute. But just remember that Jeroboam is God's choice to succeed Solomon as king. But he says, look, David's family is going to bear a little shame because of what's going on here, but it's not going to go on forever. He said, you know what? I liked David. He was a man after my own heart. There's going to be a time of punishment, but it won't be forever.
What happens to the couple?
Huh? You know, I keep asking myself that because there's 12 tribes in Israel. And if 10 is going to Jeroboam and only 1 to David, we still got 1 that's unaccounted for. I haven't been able to reconcile that yet. So I've just decided to go with it for right now. All I know is there's 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes. Traditionally, it's been broken up into there's 10 northern tribes, 2 southern tribes. Judah and Benjamin are the 2 southern tribes. So I'm assuming that they're saying 1 here, but they're counting Judah and Benjamin, the 2 southern tribes that will be in the southern kingdom. Well, Solomon gets word that this has happened, and he says, well, you know, I know how to fix this. I'll just kill that sucker. And he does. He tries to kill Jeroboam, and he's not successful. So, in the end, Solomon is going to come to the end of his earthly life, which is a peaceful end. It just says, let's see how it's put here. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? So, throughout this chunk of the Bible here, we'll keep hearing this. Are they not written in? And it'll give us the name of a book that we don't have in here. So, not everything that was written during this time is included in the Bible. And this is one of them. So Solomon ends up ruling for 40 years. He dies. He's buried in Jerusalem. And his son Rehoboam succeeds him as king. And that's the key right there. That was the earthly choice to succeed him, which made sense because, you know, you take one of the king's sons and elevate him to king. So the people says, hey, Rehoboam, guess what? You're next up. Your dad's dead, you're king. Except God's like, that's not how I said it's just going to happen. So Jeroboam is God's choice. Rehoboam is the people's choice. In chapter 12, we see the kingdom that was united under David will then become split again because of Solomon's sin. So Rehoboam is now king. They crown him down in Shechem. Jeroboam hears about it, and he returns to confront Rehoboam. And now he doesn't come and say, hey, look, I'm the rightful king. God has made me king. He just comes and says, hey, you know what? We've got some problems here we need to work out. He says, you know, under your dad Solomon, our workload was, man, it was a hefty workload. why don't you ease up a little bit? Maybe your dad worked us a little bit too hard. Rehoboam says, interesting thing. I'm going to have to think on this a little bit. Why don't you go away for 3 days and come back, and then I'll let you know what I come up with. So Jeroboam and his people leave, and Rehoboam does what any good wise king should do. He starts to consult with people. So he goes to the elders, and he says, how do I respond to this? They want less work. What do you think my dad would have to say to that? And the elders said, well, your dad was a wise man. Here's probably how he would answer that. And he says, just be nice to them and they'll be nice to you. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. Treat them well and they will be subject to you and you won't have any problems. Rehoboam says, hey, that's great advice, but you old fogies, what do you know anyway? He said, I don't want to listen to you old farts. And so he goes and talks to the young men who grew up with him. Not saying that the Bible always prioritizes old wisdom over young, but here's a great case. It is a motif in the Bible that age and wisdom go together. And so we're seeing the folly of him turning away the wisdom of his older folks and turning to the younger folks and say, who cares what they say? What do you think I should do? And they're like, you know what we think? We think, spare the rod, spoil the child. Lay it to him. Tell him, you thought your work was bad under my dad, it's going to be even worse under me. You think it was bad? My little finger is thicker of a rod than his waist is. He beats you with a whip, I'll beat you with scorpions. So Rehoboam says, okay, I guess that sounds like the better advice of the two. So Jeroboam ends up coming back and he says, well, what have you decided? He says, yeah, we decided to go in a whole different direction here. We're just going to pile the work on you. He says, you know what? My father's yoke was heavy, mine will be heavier. My dad used a whip, I'm going to use scorpions on you. Because Rehoboam wouldn't listen to the people, they end up rebelling against him. And this came from the Lord, from the Lord. This was the Lord's doing. It wasn't necessarily earthly wisdom and foolishness, but it was God working behind that caused this to come about. And it was, the reason was to carry out this plan that God had to divide the kingdom, just as the prophet had shown with that torn cloak. So the Israelites renounced Rehoboam's leadership. You know what the funny thing is, as a leader, sometimes you need to stop and look back to make sure people are still following you, You can't, it's very hard. Leaders throughout history have saw that it's very hard to force people to follow you. It's easy to get people to follow you if you treat them right, but when you treat them wrong, they don't have to listen to you. And that's what happened to the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes. They're like, okay, we're done. We're not going to follow this fool if he's going to act like that. And so they all head on back to their own tents. One of Rehoboam's officials seek to call him out, and they stone him to death. And in fact, Rehoboam barely escapes with his own life, and he hightails it from Shechem on back into to Jerusalem, back where his palace was. So the 10 tribes of Israel, we'll call that the northern kingdom from now on, they end up making Jeroboam king over it, which was God's plan all along. God had already ordained that. Only the tribe of Judah, and I think Benjamin as well, continued to follow Rehoboam as king. So now we effectively have a divided kingdom. We have two kingdoms now. Northern kingdom, which is called the tribes of Israel, and then we have the southern kingdom, which is called the tribe of Judah. So from here on out, until we get to the exile, where first the northern kingdom falls, then the southern kingdom falls in exile, they will be referred to as the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Judah. So Rehoboam mobilizes troops from Judah and from Benjamin, the two southern tribes, and they plan to go out and fight and reunite the kingdom. And they're like, look, we can't have those folks up north breaking away. It's almost like a reverse U.S. Civil War here, They decided to split, and one side was like, we can't have that. We want everybody back together again. So he goes out, and he plans to go out and to fight and to bring them back into the fold. But God sends a prophet and says, hey, come on now. tell the king not to be going out and fighting his own brothers and sisters up there. Let's just leave it be. And he says, tell the king that I, meaning God, has done this. Well, the king and his men listened, and they ended up going back home, and we settle into this new normal of having two kingdoms. Now, Jeroboam was a man who was chosen by God to lead the northern kingdom, but he is a man who lets his own ego and his own worry, his own anxiety get in the way of what God was doing. Basically what he does is he starts to worry about his people going back to being subject to Rehoboam. And here's why. Because Rehoboam now controls the city of Jerusalem, which is in the southern kingdom. And Jerusalem is a place where the temple is. Jerusalem and the temple is a place where the Israelites would have gone to offer their sacrifices. So Jeroboam in his wisdom says, you know what? If my people go to Jerusalem, they might just want to stay subject to the people in Jerusalem. So I'm going to have to set up some form of worship center for them, where they don't have to go down to the southern part. So he says, you know what would be a great idea? He says, we ought to make a golden calf. Wow, that's a hyperlink, y'all. That'll take us right back to Mount Sinai when Moses is on the mountain and his brother Aaron's down there, and they're like, hey, has anybody seen Moses from? No, been at least a month. Well, I guess he ain't coming back. Like, Aaron, why don't you get some of this gold to make a golden calf for us to worship? Well, not only does Jeroboam decide to make a golden calf, he doubles down on what Aaron did. He says, if one calf was good, two's got to be better. Yes, sir. He's got to write two of them. So he has two golden calves made for the people to worship. And so he talks to the people and he says, look, going to Jerusalem, man, that's such a treacherous trip. You don't want to go to Jerusalem. Here, man, we've got some perfectly good idols for you to worship. And for your worshiping convenience, we're going to set one up here, and then we're going to set one up north. So, wherever you at, you always got a convenient golden calf to worship. Now, he also built shrines on the high places. So you got these golden calves, which would be your primary worship spots, and then you'd have like little churches all around, little shrines all around. So for the intermediate style worship, and then for all this worship to be going on, you're going to need priests. Now, remember, God said all the priests would come from either the line of Aaron or through the Levites. Well, he says, don't see too many Levites around, so you know what, Dickie, you're not from the tribe of Levi, but you're a pretty good guy. We'll make you a priest today.
He knows cows.
What's that?
He knows cows.
Yeah, you know cows, man. You're a cow guy. Here's a golden calf. Man, you can lead worship. You're a priest. Now, not saying Dickie's not a good guy, but Dickie's not a Levite. God did not want anybody but the Levites doing this work. But here, Jeroboam sets these priests up anyway. He sets up his own festivals to rival those that are in Jerusalem. So it really is like he's taking what God has got going on in the southern kingdom and kind of perverting it for his own, rather than doing things the way that God's already set up.
And the Ark of the Covenant is securely in the...
He is in, at this point, it's in the, yes, it's in the temple in Jerusalem. And then he himself went and offered sacrifices in Bethel, the southern place where he had that one calf set up, golden calf, and he offered sacrifices of that golden calf. How do y'all think that went with old God? I don't think God was going to be very happy. So in chapter 13, God sends a messenger called the man of God from Judah. So this messenger comes from the southern kingdom, and this messenger's job was to speak out against Jeroboam. Except he doesn't go right to the king to call him out. He goes to the altar where one of these golden calves are at, where Jeroboam is presiding over the sacrifices, and this man of God speaks to the altar and he prophesies human death and sacrifice. He says, altar, I don't like what you're doing up here. And you know what's going to happen? There are going to be human bones that are going to be sacrificed on you. And you know what? You're going to break in two and your ashes are going to be spilt out all over the place. And Jeroboam standing there and goes, who is this knucklehead up here? He goes, wait a second, I think he's talking about me, guys. Oh, well, we can't have. So he stretches out his hand, because he's presiding over the altar, stretches out his hand to rebuke him and tell somebody, seize that guy. Let's make an example of him. As soon as he stretches out his hand, it shrivels up, and he can't draw it back in. And at the same time, the altar splits in two, just as the man had prophesied, and ashes spill out, just as God said. It's a sign from the Lord. Well, old Jeroboam, he's figured this out. He's like, I'm guessing this is one of God's prophets and come to set things right. And so he pleads with the prophet to pray for him. He says, and listen to this. He doesn't say, pray to God for my hand to be healed. He said, pray to the Lord your God. At this point, he understands he's got a separation between him and God. And it's a small distinction, but one that hit me like a ton of bricks. He says, please pray to the Lord your God that he would heal my hand. Intercede for me. And the man of God intercedes, and his hand is restored. Then Jeroboam is, he's really grateful for this, and he invites the prophet, as any good church-going person should. He says, hey, why don't you come home and have a bite to eat with me? And the prophet says, man, even if you offered me half your kingdom, I wouldn't go with you, man. He said, you're damaged goods. He said, I wouldn't eat your food, I wouldn't drink your water. He said, God warned me already not to eat or drink while I was here, and to leave and go back by another road. And so he does. So he returns back home, or starts back home by a different route. Now there's an old prophet in Bethel who hears of this tale, and the person who comes to tell him about this, he says, which way did that man of God go? He's like, well, I think he went down by, he went home by Highway 3. He didn't go back down 170, he went Highway 3. All right, saddle up a donkey. I got to go see this guy. So the prophet goes and he follows the man of God, finds him sitting under a tree. And he says, hey, why don't you come back with me? Let's have a bite to eat. Let's get something to drink. And the guy tells the same story. I can't. God told me not to. He says, well, I got a secret for you. I am also a prophet. And God sent an angel to me saying, go chase that guy down and invite him to come back and eat. God's cool with it. He said it's good. He changed his mind. Come on back with me. And so the man of God says, all right, I'll go with you. So he goes back, eats, drinks with this old prophet, but it doesn't go well because he was lied to, and he didn't have the wisdom to discern he had been lied to. So God rebukes him for not following directions, but he uses the old prophet as his mouthpiece. The old prophet says, this is what God said. Because you didn't follow directions, you're going to die. And not only are you going to die, you're not going to die back home where you can be buried with your ancestors. You're going to die here. And the man of God is like, all right, you know what? This got real. I'm out of here. Jumps on his donkey and takes off. Doesn't get too far until a lion jumps out, mauls him and kills him. He falls dead by the side of the road. The lion doesn't mess with the donkey that he's riding. So now you got a lion and a donkey standing over the body. People go by and see this, and they can't figure out what's going on. So they go back and tell the old prophet, and the old prophet's like, oh, this is all my fault. The old prophet goes out there with the donkey, sees that everything is, sees the guy's dead, but sees at least the lion's not tearing him limb from limb. And he goes over and he collects the body, brings the body back, mourns over the body, because he knows that he's the one that caused this, and then he buries this guy's body in his own tomb. Now, if you're Jeroboam, and you've seen all this happen, first your hand is shriveled up, your altar is cracked in two, the man disobeyed God, and you hear that he is now dead and laying in a tomb of one of your city's finest prophets, wouldn't you think that it'd be time to say, you know what, God, maybe I made a mistake here. How can I make this right? Not old Jeroboam. Jeroboam refused to repent, and he continued to sin against God. So, in chapter 14, God pronounces a disaster on the house of Jeroboam, or basically on his household. So his son ends up getting sick. And as most of us might, when we see our kids sick and suffering, we can't stand it. So Jeroboam says, well, I think what we need to do is we need to get a prophet over here to see if we can get this kid fixed up. And he says, but you know what? The prophets all know that God's mad at me. So he goes to his wife and says, hey wife, I got a plan. Why don't you dress up and put on a disguise? Why don't you go see this old prophet named Ahijah? You know, he's kind of old and he don't see well anyway. So if you got a good enough disguise, he's not going to know it's you. So go and seek out that prophet in Shiloh. Take some gifts with you and then inquire about what's going to happen to the boy. See if the prophet can give you some good news. So she follows the plan to a T. She goes to Shiloh to see the prophet. She's dressed up. Nobody would recognize her. Like I've already told you, the prophet's eyes were weak because he was old. But God had already spoken to that prophet and says, hey, by the way, Jeroboam's wife is coming. She's going to come in disguise. You know it. Call her out when she gets here. So she gets to the house. She goes in. And the prophet says, hey, how's it going, Jeroboam's wife? Good to see you. Come on in. I know what you're here for, and I ain't got good news for you. So the prophet gives her the bad news. He says, look, you need to tell Jeroboam that since he screwed up, since he sinned against God, he's going to be punished. God says that he is about to bring a disaster on the house of Jeroboam. And what he then does is he recites a poem about God's disaster plan. And then he says, all right, time for you to, I've told you everything you need to know, time for you to hit the road, go back home. Oh wait, before you go, one more thing. Kind of like Columbo. One more thing. When your feet enter your city, your son's going to die. He said, but here's good news. Your son's going to die. All the rest of your family's going to die. In the cities, they're going to be feasted on by the dogs, and out in the fields, the birds are going to pick the flesh off their bones. But God has found something good in your son, and when he dies, he will be buried in the family tomb. But make no mistake, he's the only one in your family that's going to find such good treatment. And he says, God is eventually going to raise up a new king who will eliminate Jeroboam's household. So she goes home. Sure enough, as soon as she sets foot back in her hometown, her son dies, he's buried. Jeroboam ends up reigning for 22 years as king, and then he dies. And his son Nadab then becomes king of Israel, the northern kingdom. All right, so now we switch back to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. We'll find through the rest of Kings, Chronicles, let's see, there's Kings, and then Chronicles, yeah. Through Kings and Chronicles, we'll be flipping back and forth a lot of times between Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom. Sometimes we'll focus on the Northern Kingdom for a few kings, and sometimes we'll go southern, but there's a lot of flip-flopping. So if you get lost, tell me, stop, we'll try to retrace our steps to figure out where we're at. But right now, we're leaving King Jeroboam, we're jumping back down to King Rehoboam in the southern kingdom. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. During that time, Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They built high places, sacred pillars, all this stuff we already know. We've already covered this. Asherah poles on every hill. They had male shrine prostitutes or cult prostitutes throughout the land. And they imitated all the detestable practices of the original inhabitants of that land, the people they were supposed to kill and drive out because they were going to be a stumbling block. And now we're seeing, we're seeing all this stuff come to fruition now. In Rehoboam's 5th year of being king, Egypt decided to come and raid Jerusalem. And while they were there, they stole all the gold out of the temple, out of the treasury, took all the gold with them. They raided the temple treasury, they raided the palace treasury. They even stole all of the gold shields that Solomon had built or had fashioned when he was putting together everything. So with no gold available, Rehoboam did the next best thing. He took bronze and had bronze shields made to replace them. Let's see. So Rehoboam and Jeroboam remained at war for all the time that they reigned as kings. And then eventually Rehoboam dies, and his son Abijam takes his place as king. So now Jeroboam in the northern kingdom is dead. His son Nadab is king in the northern. Rehoboam dies, and his son Abijam is the king in the southern kingdom. Chapters 15 and 16, they just recount the various kingships of Judah and Israel. Not really much going on there in the way of good storytelling. So we get to chapter 17, there's just a succession of kings. We get down to chapter 17, and at that time, the king in the south was a king named Asa, A-S-A, and Israel's king was King Ahab. Now there's a name that we've probably heard at some point, old King Ahab, not Ahab the Arab, salt of the burning sands. I know somebody was thinking Ray Stevens there when I said Ahab. But no, King Ahab. Now King Ahab's a bad king. He's the king up north, King Asa's the king down south. King Ahab has done, at some point, King Ahab has done evil in the eyes of the Lord. Oh, here we go, back in chapter 16. In 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. So, since we now have two opposing kingdoms, a lot of times, as a way of a timeline, they'll say, okay, in the 12th year of the reign of the northern king, this guy became king in the south. That's how they, so in this house, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Now, Samaria, that is the Jerusalem of the north. That is the main city up north now. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And we're going to hear some stories about him. You're going to find that, yeah, this was just one bad dude. So when we find him and pick this up in chapter 17, God sends a messenger to speak a word of rebuke against Ahab. And here's another very familiar name, Elijah. Elijah was a prophet that God is going to use mightily. And he goes to tell King Ahab that God says, hey, Ahab, God doesn't like what you've been doing. And he is going to send a drought on the land. It is going to be 3 years without a drop of rain. Now, how do you think King Ahab takes that news? Is he going to be happy to hear? And there's a reason we have this saying, don't kill the messenger, because at some point somebody has tried to kill a messenger that brought news that you didn't want to hear. So Elijah tells King the bad news, and then God says, Elijah, if you want to keep your head firmly attached to your shoulders, you might want to take off. Let's just skedaddle for a little while. And so he tells him to run east and go hide in the Wadi Desert, or the Wadi Cherith. This would have been a land that would have been kind of desolate. And remember, there's not going to be any rain for 3 years anyway. So God says, you know what? I'll take care of it. And he sends ravens to bring Elijah bread and meat to sustain him. And pretty soon the wadi dries up. Wadi is kind of like a creek or something. Well, it dries up for lack of rain. So he's got food, but he's got no water. And God then says, Elijah, time to go to a different place. He says, I've found a widow who's going to take care of you. I want you to go, and I want you to go talk to her. And so Elijah goes, and he sees this widow. When he gets over here, he sees this widow gathering wood. And he walks up to her and he says, excuse me, ma'am. Can I have just a little bit of water and a piece of bread? And she says, man, you just don't know what you're asking for. You don't even know the troubles I've seen. She says, I've just got just a little touch of oil, a handful of flour. I'm gathering this wood to go home and to prepare that into a little loaf of bread for my son and I to eat and to die, because it's all we got left. We're facing sure and certain death. And Elijah says, hey, that's your business. You know what? If you're down and out and you think this is your last meal, so be it. But before you do all this, why don't you just make me a little bit of a small loaf of bread? That's all I'm asking you, is a small loaf of bread. After you make me a loaf of bread. And now this sounds kind of selfish, right? You got a man of God coming to a woman saying, you know, I know you've got trouble, and I know you don't have anything. feed me first, and then make something for you and your son. But that's exactly what he does. He says, make me a loaf first, then make something for yourself and your son. And he says, by the way, God says that your flour and oil, that little bit that you have that you think is just enough for you and your son's last meal, guarantee you that thing won't run out until it starts to rain again. Now, I don't know about you, some crazy fool just wanders in and out of the desert, asks me to make him something to eat before I eat the last morsel I've got, and says, oh, by the way, God tells me that little bit's going to last forever.
And he was a good salesman.
He was a good salesman, because guess what she did? She followed his instructions. So she goes and she makes him something to eat, and then she makes something for her and her son, and it just kept on. It kept on, and they eat for many, many days. Now, sometime after this, her son becomes sick, and he dies. And the mom, of course, in her grief, she lashes out at the nearest thing, which is Elijah, and she accuses Elijah of killing him because of her guilt. She thinks she's got some guilt of some kind for something she's done, and she accuses Elijah of killing her son because of that. Elijah takes the son to the upper room, and he cries out to God, and he says, God, you sent me to this woman, you provide for her, why have you brought this tragedy on this woman? This is her only son. Her husband's dead. Why would you do this? He lays the boy down, and he stretches out and lays on top of the kid. So like the kid's laying on his back on the thing, and he lays on the kid, face down on the kid, arms stretched out. Then he gets up. Then he does it again. Then he gets up. And he does it a third time. And then he cries out to the Lord, and God listened to Elijah, and the boy came back to life. So we think that whole thing with Jesus and Lazarus was something special. Man, Elijah done this thing like 2,000 years before that. And so, the boy, he raises up the boy from the dead. And then the woman says to Eli, now that I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. So, remember I preach a lot about a lot of the signs and wonders and healings that Jesus did was not necessarily to fill a need of the people, although it filled that need. Let's say the blind man when he received his sight. They were mostly done to prove that God was at work in the person and the work of Jesus, to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, here we see that this woman obviously needed her son, but with her pronouncement here, now that I know that you're a man of God and the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth, her son being raised was a wonderful testimony, and it convinced her of who Elijah was and who God was. So even this is not done necessarily for her benefit, it's done for God's benefit, to prove the trustworthiness of God. So after a long time, chapter 18, and then we'll probably wrap it up after chapter 18 here. God tells Elijah, hey, you know that guy trying to kill you, old King Ahab? I want you to go talk to him again. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm Elijah, I'm going to be like, I don't know if that's such a good idea. But he says, go and present yourself to Ahab, and I am going to send rain on the land. So 3 years have passed per the proclamation, and God's getting ready to do a thing. So Elijah goes and he presents himself to Ahab. Ahab summons Obadiah because the famine was so severe. And I'm not sure what Obadiah was supposed to be. He was the palace administrator, and I don't know what he was supposed to do. But he was a devout believer in the Lord. Now, Ahab's wife Jezebel, there's another name that rings a bell in our minds, Jezebel. She was the queen. It was Ahab's wife. She is killing the Lord's prophets. Now, Obadiah had taken 100 of God's prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each. He'd given them food and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, go throughout the land, go to all the springs and valleys, and maybe we can find a few blades of grass to keep the horses and mules alive so that we won't have to kill our animals. And so they divided up the land that they were supposed to cover. Abraham goes in one direction and Obadiah goes in another. while he is out looking for grass, Obadiah meets Elijah. And Elijah tells him, he says, hey, go tell King Ahab that I want to talk to him. And Obadiah resists, thinking Elijah would vanish and he'd be killed. Because think about this, if I'm Obadiah and I go to the king and says, hey king, you know your mortal enemy, the one you've been looking for 3 years, the one that brought this drought on? Well, he's just down the road a piece, and he sent me back here to say, hey, he wants to talk to you. Well, now, if I'm King Ahab, and I'm like, all right, finally I get my hands on that little creep, and I go out there, and there is no Elijah, I'm probably going to kill the messenger. Obadiah's like, well, hold on, I don't want to get in the middle of all this. But Elijah says, look, I promise you, you just go tell the king I'll be waiting right here for him when he gets back. And so Ahab ends up meeting Elijah on Mount Carmel, and he calls up to him. He's like, is that you, you troubler of Israel? And he said, man, you and your father, this is Elijah talking down to Ahab. He said, you and your father's family are the troublemakers, old King Ahab. You're the one that abandoned God's laws. You're the one that worshiped the Baals. Oh, yeah. And so Elijah says, I tell you what, we're going to have a little show and tell here. We're going to see who is who. He says, I tell you what, some of the Israelites get 50 prophets of Baal, get 400 prophets of Asherah, those same sorry scoundrels that eat at your queen's table, and bring them up here. And so Ahab assembles everybody up on Mount Carmel, and Elijah tells the people, he said, look, you can't follow two gods. You got to choose right now who you're going to follow. If the Lord is God, if Yahweh is God, that's who you need to follow. But if Baal is God, then you need to follow Baal. You can't walk a middle road here. You got to do one or the other. And the people just sat there, much like church folk on Sunday morning. They don't say nothing. They're just like, we're going to see how this plays out, right? And Elijah then challenged the prophets of Baal to a duel. He says, man, let's settle this once and for all. He said, I'm the only prophet of God left. I'm the only one here. One servant of God. Baal over here has 450 people on his side. Let's each one of us prepare a bull for sacrifice, and then we'll call on our God. Here's the deal. We're going to put this slaughtered bull on the altar. We're going to put the wood around it, and we're going to pour a whole bunch of water on it. And then we're going to call on each one of us call on our gods to light that thing on fire. Whoever can do it first, that's the God who wins. Sound like a good deal? And then Baal prophets are like, man, we got this. This fool don't know what he's doing. And so he says, and you know what? I tell you what, just to be a good sport, I'm going to let you guys go first. You guys get to go first. And so Baal's prophets, they prepare everything, get it set up there, and they call on Baal from morning until noon. They're chanting, they're calling, they're praying. Baal, set this thing on fire. Come on, man. Let's do this. From morning until noon, no answer. And so Elijah, like a good Gamecock fan, begins to taunt him. He said, hey, what's the matter with your Baal over there? He's like, shout louder. Maybe he can't hear you. He's like, oh, I know it is. Maybe he is in deep thought. And he can't, he's in meditation, he can't hear you. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's just too busy. You know what it is? I bet you he took a little nap. He's sleeping and he can't hear you. Shout louder, shout louder. And so these prophets, all 450, they're shouting, they're slashing themselves with swords and spears, and they continue all the way up to the time for the evening sacrifice. Still no fire. And Elijah says, all right, you guys had your shot, now it's my turn. And so he rebuilds the Lord's altar that had been torn down. He arranges the sacrifice, digs a trench all the way around the altar. And then he tells the people, put some water on this. So they pour water on it. He's like, that's pretty wet. Do it again. They pour water on it. He's like, I still don't think that's enough water. Douse it again. And so they pour water on it a third time. Everything was so wet, the water went down, filled up the trench all the way around the altar table and everything. And then he prayed to God. He says, God, let the fire come down. And God sent the fire, and it came down, and it burned up the sacrifice. It burned up all that wet wood. It even burned up the stones and the soil. I'm talking scorched earth. Even licked up all the water in the trench. I mean, this is a powerful God that came down. And all the people, all them church folk that were sitting here not saying nothing, saying, we're going to see how this plays out. They're like, okay, we got it now. And they all fall down on their face, and they proclaim that the Lord is God. Elijah has all those false prophets seized, takes them over to the Kishon Valley, and has them slaughtered. And now, for the rain that's to come, he tells Ahab, he's like, Ahab, you might want to go eat and drink something. It's been a long day. I think I hear the sound of a heavy rain coming. So Elijah goes down to eat and to drink, Ahab goes down to eat and drink, but Elijah stays up on that mountain. Elijah tells the servant, he says, hey, look out over the sea. What do you see? The servant looks, goes, there ain't nothing out there, Elijah. For 7 times, Elijah sends that servant back and has him look. 7 times looking. I don't think I see anything yet. And the last time, the servant says, wait a second. I see a little cloud out there. It's about as small as a man's hand. He says, all right, that's all I need. You go down and talk to Ahab. You go down there and tell him to hitch up his chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Because, man, it's going to rain so hard, your chariot is going to get stuck in the mud if you stay up here. And meanwhile, that small little cloud had grown and grown and grown, and the whole sky grew black, and the wind rose, and here comes the rain. And the rain fell, and the rain fell, and the rain fell. Well, Ahab is on his chariot, and he's, let's see, where am I at now? Let's see, as the heavy rain started to fall, Ahab rode off to Jezreel, which was another town close by. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he tucks his cloak in his belt. Now remember, Ahab is on a chariot with a horse. Elijah's on foot, but with the power of the Lord, he tucks the cloak into his belt, and he took off running, and he beat Ahab to Jezreel. So that's where we're going to close it up tonight. At the end of chapter 18, God has sent a powerful message on those who would turn their back on him and go astray from his plan. And this is not the last we're going to hear of Ahab. We'll follow the story of Ahab a little bit more next week, and we'll just see this is as despicable as he is. His wife, Jezebel, is even worse. And we'll see they get their comeuppance, but we'll pick up all that next week. Before we go, any questions, concerns, observations, or thoughts?
I think people would have stories passed down that the golden calf thing did not work.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, they still do.
Oh yeah.
Well, but remember though, every 40 years they were pretty much wiped out, and then people started again, and they never believed, because I don't hear them repeating the story like they used to do.
Right.
And
Well,
they've got more and more lousy kings.
oh yeah, and they will have more and more lousy kings. But, I mean, you know, one observation I had when I was reading, King Solomon. This is a man who God spoke to personally twice in a vision, right? This is a man who had as close, how many of us sitting around this table has God spoken to 2 times in their life? I mean, in a vision directly, we know it was God. And yet, we still know what we're supposed to do, and we fairly well do a good job of it. But this man, he had everything, and he still did exactly the opposite of what God told him to do, what his father gave him good advice to do. It just shows how easily our heart can be led astray if we're not careful. So that was a powerful observation for me. But yeah, that golden calf thing, that's crazy. We're still doing that.
I was wondering, I've heard from historical things that I guess this other religious things, that Sheba and Solomon had a relationship. And that I was just wondering if that was a possibility, since he seems to be hooking up with all these concubines and all these other people.
Well, it's definitely a possibility. It's not biblical, but I mean, anything's possible. Yeah. I do like looking outside the Bible to fill in some of the blanks, but we have to be careful when we do that, that we're not supplanting what the Bible tells us. So the Bible is silent on that, other than the fact that they met at least once and they were impressed with each other. But the Bible doesn't indicate it's anything more than the professional respect for each other. So, but it could have been much more. Anything else?
I was thinking about Ark of the Covenant, this thing that they touch and die.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even that always in their presence,
Mhm.
I mean, always available.
Always
Should
available.
be a reminder,
Should be.
But at this point, is the ark hasn't been moved yet.
No,
has
the
it?
ark's still in Jerusalem.
just the mere fact is this thing,
Yeah, the presence of God is there. You know, you would think that would keep it fresh in your mind.
rather than trying to make another thing.
Yeah.
Well, they were so busy running around after the other guys, they weren't going over there by the ark to get
Yeah.
toasted.
And just think, I mean, it's not the Ark of the Covenant, but each one of us has a relationship with the local church, with a congregation. And even this pandemic has shown that, you know, once you get out of the habit of going, which many of us were forced out of coming to church for a while, it's easy to get led astray by whatever it is that keeps us away from God and not get back into that community again. So, you know, I definitely don't want to judge them too harshly, because I don't think I'm any better than they are half the time. So, all right, dear friends, that's all I got this week. Go in peace and be God's people.
Amen.
Thank you, guys.
Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.